of Shabbos. We drank a lot of wine these last few weeks. Some of us, many of us, 4 cups at the first Seder, 4 cups of wine at the second Seder, Kiddush during the day, Kiddush at night and during the day, the second days. That's a dozen cups already before whatever fruity Beaujolais you paired with the chicken or the spicy cab that washed down the brisket. Don't forget Havdalah a couple of times. We've come a long way since Manischewitz or Shapiro's or whatever the syrupy, sweet Concord grape sacramental wine was at your family's Seder back in the day. By the way, I had always told people that any wine you find anyone you find that's kosher is also kosher for Pesach, until I found evidence to the contrary. We were benching at Shalosh one Shabbos afternoon a few years ago, downstairs in the Davidson Social Hall, and I happened to just glance at the bottle on the table, and it said, not kosher for Passover. I rubbed my eyes. First, I thought I was imagining things. But after Shabbos, I did a little research, and sure enough, this particular wine, I'm afraid if I tell you the brand, it might be Lashon Hara. This one wine is not kosher for Passover. Now, if you wanted to make wine that wasn't Pesach, where would you even start? I'll give you a hint. High fructose corn syrup. That's right. Just when you think kosher wine couldn't get any sweeter or any more syrupy, but of course, if you put corn syrup into it, as this company does, it makes it kitnius, not so good for Ashkenazim on Pesach. But let's not talk too much about corn syrup and wine. And to sweeten the deal, I won't tell you any of the corny wine jokes that I have in my treasury. Rather, let's take a peek at the mention of wine in the Torah, particularly as it's implicated both in the beginning and end of our portion this week. Beginning of our parsha is Yom HaShmini. That's where the parsha gets its name, Shmini. It was on the 8th day. So what's the first 7 days? There were 7 days of getting the Mishkan ready for service. And in those 7 days, Moshe Rabbeinu showed Bnei Yisrael how to disassemble and reassemble the entire tabernacle to make it completely portable, how to set up the altar, how to do the offerings, the korbanot. That was the warm-up week. And the grand opening was supposed to be on the 8th day. So Aaron, Moshe's brother, is supposed to be the high priest, and his sons, Elazar and Itamar, Nadav and Avihu, will help out. Big day arrives, the Mishkan is open for business, and bang, tragedy strikes. The unexpected happens as Nadav and Avihu bring as an offering an Eish Zara, the Torah says, a foreign fire, something that was not commanded them. They improvised, they riffed, they went off script. Somehow they decided they would bring an offering which they felt would be meaningful, even though it was not the prescribed order of the day. The verse at the beginning of chapter 10 says, Aaron's sons Nadav and Avihu each took his fire pan, placed fire on it, and incense on that. Vayikchu b'nei Aharon Nadav Avihu ish machtasoi v'yitnu v'hen eish v'yasimu alav ketoras. And they offered this extraneous fire, which God had not commanded them, v'yakrivu lifnei Hashem eish zara asher lo itziva osam, and subsequently they died. And the verse tells us in exact detail what happened. Vateitze eish milifnei Hashem, a fire went out from before God, the same exact description as in previous verses talking about how the offerings were consumed. It says, Vatochal osam vayamusu lifnei Hashem. The fire consumed them, Nadav and Avihu, and they died before God. Again, there was no prescription, there was no instruction for incense for this inauguration, so they either made a mistake, which is somewhat unlikely given the regimentation of the service, which again, remember, Moshe had just shown them and everyone else what would happen for 7 days in a row, or there was an error in judgment somehow. That seems to be the more likely scenario. The question is why? Rashi mentions 2 explanations for the severe and swift retribution here. One is that the 2 sons, Nadav and Avihu, decided a halacha on their own in the presence of their rabbi, Moshe, which we're not supposed to do. That's Rabbi Eliezer's answer. And Rabbi Yishmael's explanation is that they were shikr. They had something to drink, and this is not allowed. So they died. This is actually a frequently used explanation, and Mayam Lois uses it as a springboard for a whole conversation about the evils of the bottle, drunkenness, and all that. Okay, fair enough. And 8 verses later, it does in fact say that the Kohanim should not drink wine before they engage in the divine service. And that, in fact, is reflected even in our practice today, known to a very few who come early to Shul on Simchas Torah morning. Only on Simchas Torah morning we have the Kohanim Duchan give us their priestly blessing in Shacharis rather than Musaf, as they usually do on Yom Tov, just in case in the course of the morning's hakafos and festivities and all that, if a Kohen happens to make Kiddush and happens to say L'chaim, that would render him unfit to bless us. So we get that bracha out of them first thing in the morning, hopefully before they've had a chance to hit the sauce. But this really only raises a larger question. As unlikely as it would be that two of Aaron's sons would commit such a gross procedural foul up, isn't it at least as unlikely that they would come to work drunk on their first day on the job? Doesn't seem to fit, doesn't make sense. Of course, you have the offspring of the famous misbehaving all the time. You could write the history of the Western world just on wayward children. But again, why? How? It seems possible, at least, that they were intoxicated, but maybe wine was not the culprit. In any event, that instruction that you shouldn't drink wine before you do the service if you're a Kohen, it's not given till after they died already. It seems more than a little unjust to punish them for a transgression that hadn't even been outlawed yet. Perhaps the intoxication, the lack of clear vision, was caused by their own spiritual desires. Perhaps the intoxication was not chemical, but emotional or spiritual. Nadav and Avihu wanted, desired real communion, real connection with God, mystical union. They wanted to become so intimately connected with God, the source of life and being, that that's actually what they did, to the point where their souls could not be contained in their bodies anymore and returned. Their souls left their bodies and reconnected with God, with the origin, the source. In other words, they got exactly the kind of spiritual connection they were looking for, absolute spirituality that could no longer maintain a connection to the physical. If that's so, then the Torah in this case is not condemning inebriation per se, which in any case you should avoid it. It even says, look back to Parshas Noach. There you have plenty of reason to avoid getting drunk. It explains over there. The intoxication here that we're supposed to avoid is not from the bottle. It's to avoid being intoxicated and led astray by our own highest and even most admirable intentions. It's good to want to be spiritual. But if that causes you to turn your back on being connected to and being grounded in the material world, then it's too much. As a footnote, we should add that Nadav and Avihu were Bachrim. They were not married yet. Nothing to get a person more grounded in practicality than getting married. So let's all take note of that. At the end of our parsha, as it happens, wine is also in the mix, if you will. The second part of our parsha describes the animals, the birds, the fish that we're allowed to eat, and those that we are not allowed to eat. In other words, what's kosher and what isn't. It begins by saying, these are the living things which you may eat. Zos achaya asher tochlu. And Rabbi Moshe Arama brings in his commentary a verse from Song of Songs, chapter 2, which says, he brought me into his wine storehouse, and he held the banner of love over me. He cites Rabbi Meir's explication of this. What does it mean? Says Rabbi Meir, my yetzer hara, my drives, my inclinations are so strong within me, it's like wine, which is so powerful that overwhelms a person and confuses him. Interesting parallel. Rabbi Yehuda says, not so sure. He says you really shouldn't darshan, in particular, Shir Hashirim. You shouldn't interpret the words of the Song of Songs to be uncomplimentary to the Jewish people. He doesn't like that. The meaning is, Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, replied to this actually as a question. Who has brought me into his wine storehouse? Suggesting that the great wine cellar of Mount Sinai, where God brought us and gave us the decorations of Torah, mitzvahs, good deeds and all that, and we accepted them with love. The Midrash on this verse, on Shir Hashirim, has the elements of clouded judgment, like wine does to a person, at least according to the first opinion, and at the same time, the idea, nevertheless, that wine is a blessing. In the parable, this wine cellar is open to everyone, it's open to all. So is Mount Sinai open to all who wish to learn, all who wish to master themselves and their inclinations, and put those to use, serving God the way God asks us to serve, which doesn't always align perfectly with what we think we might want. That's again the lesson from Nadav and Avihu and their unauthorized fire. Rather, let the soul lead and let the body follow. So we'll certainly eat, and ideally we'll eat what's permitted and avoid what's prohibited. Ideally, we will serve, we will offer. In the best case scenario, we will offer the prescribed offerings, which may not always include the incense in our fire pans that we think is going to get us where we want to go. On the one hand, there are a lot of goodies in the world that look delicious and tempting to the eye. On the other hand, we have to know what's really good for us by looking beyond the surface and seeing, appreciating, understanding what's truly a blessing and what only appears to be that way, but in fact is not necessarily helping us and may do the opposite. Chas v'shalom. There's an interesting Agadata, a story or a parable that the Talmud tells at the very end of Tractate Psachim, in the chapter that describes the Pesach Seder. That's where we learn the laws of the Seder. This Agadata, this story, talks about another famous meal, not the Seder, but another meal that will take place in days to come, the great feast that will be held to welcome the Messiah. So the question at this dinner is not who will be the guest speaker, that's obvious, but rather who's going to lead the benching, who will lead Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals. You have the whole family there, so it's a tough call. Remember that at the Seder, the third of the four cups that we drink, is for Birkat Hamazon. We each take a cup in our hand and we hold it during the grace after meals. This is not necessarily our everyday practice, but occasionally we do hold a cup, or at least the one leading Birkat Hamazon takes a cup of wine and holds it during the bracha. As we said before, we do this at Shalosh Shudas, if there's a bris, a Sheva brachas. It's a great honor. So at this banquet with Mashiach, they look around the room and they see whom should we honor with this. First, they offer it to Avram Avinu, to Abraham, who could be more honorable. And he says, thanks, but no thanks. He says, since he fathered Ishmael, he feels that it takes away from his worthiness a little bit. There are others maybe more deserving. So the dinner committee moves on to the next table where Yitzchak is sitting. How about you lead? Oh, thank you, he says. Remember, I'm Esav's father. Doesn't seem right. Same logic for Yaakov Avinu. He says, even though the Torah had not been revealed, had not been given to the Jewish people yet, he nevertheless married two sisters while both were alive. So he says, I'm not the one to accept the honor. Okay, well then, next, Moshe Rabbeinu, who better to lead us? Please, if you would. Well, says Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm not the one. I don't think it's fitting for me. I was not permitted to enter into the land of Israel, not while I was alive, not after I passed away. Who did though? Yehoshua, Joshua. Okay, Joshua, how about you? Joshua also declined, saying he wasn't worthy of fathering sons, so maybe this honor is not for him either. Around the room they go, looking for someone who's up to who can rise to the occasion, until they get to David HaMelech. And what does he say? Take a peek in Psalms 116 if you need a clue. We said it Hallel during Pesach over Yom Tov. King David says, famous verse, Kos Yeshua's Esa uv'shem Hashem Ekra. I will lift up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of God. And he leads Birkat Hamazon. Now say what you will about King David. There's a lot here about leadership and integrity and seizing the moment, that we could discuss that for hours. Point is that King David composed this verse, I will lift up the cup of salvation. We've incorporated it into our weekly Havdalah at the conclusion of every Shabbat. So we see that, like anything, a cup of wine can draw down great blessings, and of course it has the potential for the negative as well. So we learn from Nadav and Avihu, we should be encouraged to examine our desires and our impulses, no matter how holy they seem, and maybe the holier they seem, the more they deserve questioning. We have to ensure that we're channeling our drives in the most positive direction. As we said in the beautiful prayer for dew, Tefillas Tal, on the first day of Pesach, Livracha velo leklala, for blessing and not, heaven forbid, for the opposite. But Shabbos Chodesh Tov.